to our first workshop of the academic year. My name is Zane McGee. I'm the director of the Writing Center, and also joining us today from the Writing Center is one of our tutors, Chadwick Smith, and he's a second year student here at Candler, and he's working with us at the Writing Center. So if you schedule appointments to come in and work on a paper or anything like that, you can schedule a session directly with Chad as well. So today we're going to be talking about how to read, and specifically how to read a lot. That is, how to keep up with the reading load that you're going to face in seminary. And so my goal for this workshop is that I want it to be very, very practical. So the tips I'm going to give you are very practical. They're very much based in things that you can take from here and that you can immediately put into practice and start doing. If you have questions as we go along, feel free to just unmute and ask the question. I know that Zoom has many methods of getting my attention, but it's just quicker and faster, honestly, if you just unmute and ask your question. I'm not at all offended to be interrupted as I'm going through as well. And then I'll try to leave us a little bit of time at the end that we can ask a couple questions and give some feedback. So how do you read a lot in seminary? How do you keep up with what feels like, as we were just discussing in the lobby beforehand, what feels like being inside of a cash tornado machine and just having all of this information thrown at you, and specifically all of these reading assignments thrown at you? It begins to feel like that you can't possibly keep up with the amount of work that's being assigned to you. And in reality, that may be true, that depending on how many courses you're taking and where you're at that time, it can be almost impossible to keep up with the reading load. So today we're going to talk about practical tips for that, and we're going to see how we can get through maybe not all of the readings assigned to us, but how we can get the most out of those readings when we approach them. So the very first step of reading a book, I'll refer to books, but the principles refer to journal articles, chapters, anything like that. But the first part of any assigned reading actually doesn't begin when you pick up the material to start reading. The first task of reading actually begins with what's called pre-reading. And so what pre-reading is essentially you trying to garner as much information as you can about whatever you're reading before you actually start reading it. So this is easier in some ways with books, because books have specific material within them and on the covers and even online in book reviews. There's certain ways to get specific information about books that you can become familiar with them before you even start. It's a little harder with articles and journals or individual chapters of books, because you may not be able to find a ready-made summary of what this book is about or what this reading is about. But even in those situations, you can still look at the course syllabus. You can look at what the professor says about the reading, what title they put it underneath in the syllabus, any of those things that gives you a hint about this is what the professor's wanting me to get out of this. And so pre-reading with a book specifically starts with you asking about what the book is about, and then asking why it's relevant to the topic that's being discussed in class. So start with those two questions. What is this about, and why is it relevant? And if you go into a reading with already a general idea of those two questions and what you're supposed to gain from it and why it's relevant to what you're doing, you're already going to be a step ahead as you're reading through the book or the article, because you understand what connections you think the author is going to make and where the evidence is going. If you're reading kind of blindly down a path on a book, you can think of it kind of like hiking through a fog, or maybe even running through a fog if you're speed reading through this. And as you're running through a fog, like things are just coming at you out of the mist, and you don't know where they're coming from or what they're doing. And it's not until you get to the end of the path that you can kind of look back and see how this whole path fit together. And so reading can be like that. If you go into a article or a book blindly and you just start plowing ahead with reading, all of the information that's coming at you is just like trees out of a fog that are coming at you, and you don't know how they're fitting together. You don't know what piece of evidence is coming next. But if you have an idea of what the author's arguing and why it's important, then you already have a broad view of the trail ahead. You already have a broad view of what to expect. And so you're not surprised when trees come out, or you're not surprised when it takes a curve, or any of those things. So pre-reading kind of helps you know what to expect from a reading. And then because of that, it speeds up the reading process, and then it also increases comprehension. So how can you pre-read a book? How can you learn about a book without actually reading the book? I take some of these tips from Bo Adams, who's the director of Pitt's Library, from a workshop that he did when I was a master's student here at Candler as well. And during that workshop, he passed out books to us that none of us had any familiarity with. And he told us that we had 5, maybe 10 minutes for us to just go through this material, to go through the book, and then to give a book report to the group that we were with about what this book is about, without ever reading any pages in the book. And so this was some of the advice that he gave, and then a couple tips that I've added of my own. So here's a couple ways that you can pre-read a book and have an idea of what a book's looking to teach you and looking to share with you as you go through. So the first step is just simply scanning the cover. And that includes scanning the actual front cover of the book. I know we're not supposed to judge a book by its cover, but we can still get helpful information from it. So we look at the cover of the book. We look at what is the title of the book? What is the subtitle of the book? Oftentimes, subtitles of books are a lot more informative than the actual title, because the title's made to be catchy, and the subtitle actually tells you what the book is about. Back cover, there will be a very short blurb, either written by the publisher about what the book is about, or there will just be simply endorsements of other authors and scholars in the field. And again, by seeing which scholars are selected to comment on this book and seeing what they have to say about it, helps you put this author within the sphere of whatever field you're reading and who they're in conversation with. So we scan the cover. The next step then is to skim the preface. The preface is in my opinion, one of the most neglected parts of a book, because the preface is literally the place where the author tells you what the book is about and why they've written it. That isn't always the case. Sometimes the preface is just a simple formality where they thank the publisher and people who have helped them. But most often the preface is a place where the author tells you, this is the background of where this project came from, this is why I pursued it, and these are kind of my main goals in doing that. So we look at the preface, we see what the author thinks they're going to argue and what they're telling you that they're going to argue. The next is to study the table of contents. So look over the table of contents and see, as we talked about with running in a trail in the mist, right? If we look at the table of contents, we have if it's a basic table of contents, we have an idea of broadly what the trail ahead is, how the author is constructing their argument, the 4 or 5 chapters and the steps that they're going to take. If it's a detailed table of contents, which is a lot more helpful, then we actually get a good view of what the book is about. We begin to see the curves in the path and the trees that we're expecting. And so we already, before reading the book, have an idea of kind of the flow that this argument's going to take and how it's going to unfold. If you have a little bit more time, and you can spend a little bit more time, because the 3 steps I've mentioned right now would literally take you less than 5 minutes to do. So if you have a little bit more time to spend on this, then begin by reading the introduction and the conclusion. And that's either, if it's a book, reading the introduction and conclusion chapters, and even if it's just an article, reading the introduction and conclusion paragraphs of the article or the specific chapter, because that will tell you with the introduction what the author is telling you that they're going to argue and prove, and then with the conclusion what the author actually thinks that they've argued and proven. And I say what the author says and thinks because specifically with books, writing a book is a complicated and a long task. And so in that situation, sometimes what an author thinks they set out to do isn't what they end up doing in the end. And so it's up to you as a reader to kind of judge how well they achieve the goals that they've set out to do. And then the final resource that's most helpful with book reviews or with reading books is book reviews. So these are freely available online through numerous resources, but Pitt's, if you're reading something in the field of religion, Pitt's also has access to databases that have book reviews and theological book reviews, religious book reviews. So you can look up professional reviews written by scholars in the field and what they think about this book and how it fits in. And most of these are 1 to 2 pages long, 500 to 900 words. So they're short, you can read them in a few minutes and you have a sense of what the summary of this book is, but then also what some of the criticisms that can arise on. So by doing all of these things, by getting a sense of where you're headed with a book and the material, then you prepare yourself for what's ahead, and you're able to kind of move forward through the book, knowing what's coming ahead and being prepared for it, and knowing where to put the pieces of information that you're gaining as you go along. So I want to pause real quick and just ask if there's any questions or comments on that step before we continue to our next actual reading process. All right, then let's talk about the actual process of reading then. So one of the biggest mistakes that we all make as seminarians, I myself made it when I was completing my master's work at Candler, is that we save our reading till the end of the day, and then we go and get in our bed, and we bring our books, and we bring our comfy blanket and our pillow, and we prop ourselves up in bed, and we start reading a book, and we get 2 or 3 pages in, and before we know it, we're asleep, and we're missing all of the reading that we're supposed to be doing, right? This comes from, one, just the fact that all of us are overworked and overwhelmed in seminary, and so we're tired. But it also comes from the fact that we tend to think of reading as a passive process. We tend to think of reading as me sitting and absorbing information. And so I just move my eyes across the page and the information gets passed to me. It would be much more helpful for us to think about reading as an active practice. That is, that we have to actively engage with what's in front of us. So think about it as a conversation with a person. And if you were to be having a conversation with a person, and you've probably had conversations with people on the flip side where you're talking to them, and as you're talking to them, you can see like their eyes are glazing over, they're looking off in the distance, they're looking at their phone, like they've lost contact with you as a speaker, and so they're no longer actively engaged with you. And the same thing happens mentally with reading, is that we can read without actually reading. We can see the words on the page without actually absorbing what they mean. And so we want to be active readers. We want to engage with the text. That means engaging our minds with the text, being active, being participants, being questioners of the text. But it also means being bodily engaged with the text. And so for me, that means sitting in a chair, not sitting in bed, not sitting on a couch, but sitting in a chair that forces me to be upright, that forces me to engage with the text, to hold the text. And in doing that with your body, you're presenting yourself as being engaged with the text, as being at work, in a sense, with the text that you're reading. So try to think about how your body posture as well affects how well you're reading. Because you can read, if you're actively engaged, you can read a lot quicker and absorb a lot more material than if you're kind of passively skimming over the material. And then at the end, you've read for an hour and a half, but you haven't absorbed very much of the material. So here's a few tips for simple ways that you can be an active reader. And the most simplest way is that you can simply make annotations in the text as you go along. So think of annotations in a text, writing in a text, as your way of responding in a conversation, right? When we're going back to our conversation analogy, if we're having a conversation with somebody and they're giving us a blank stare, then we don't feel like they're engaged with us. But if they're not even saying anything back to us, but they're giving us head nods, and they're giving and they're giving us yes, that tells us that they're engaged with us, that they're participating in the conversation with us. So that's what essentially making notes on your readings is it's you as a reader saying yes, saying, I don't understand what you're saying, raising a question, nodding your head. That's what making notes in your reading is doing. And so here's a simple kind of reading annotations that you can use. The thing that I like to say to all of us as we begin seminary and begin thinking about how we're reading and how we're taking notes is that the first step in taking notes is that you should throw away your highlighter. Don't use a highlighter to take notes, because the only thing that a highlighter does is draw your attention to a specific sentence on a specific page. And most of the time what happens is that, one, we over highlight material. And so you end up with a page that has 60, 70, 80% of it highlighted. And the second thing that highlighting does is it doesn't tell us anything about the information that you've highlighted. So if you highlighted a whole chapter and then I was to pick 2 sentences out of that that you've highlighted and ask you, why is this sentence important and why is this sentence important? You couldn't tell me without rereading those sentences. And if you're having to reread the material to know why it's important, then you're kind of defeating the point of taking notes as you go along. So instead of that, there's a simple system that you can use, and you'll see this if you check out books from Pitts and you happen to get a professor's old book. It's a fairly common system that people use, and so you may actually see this in some of the books at Pitts. I don't, since this meeting's being recorded, I obviously do not advocate writing in the books at Pitts, but if you insist on being a rebel, please use a pencil for all of our sake. So here's the first step, is that instead of highlighting, this will be your primary mode of taking notes in this. Instead of highlighting, you want to go through and you want to make simple lines, vertical lines on your text as you're working through. And so what this looks like, if I had a whiteboard, I would show you here. But let me see if I can pull up a pen. Yeah, here we go. Can y'all see that? All right, so what you do with the reading is instead of highlighting, go back. So instead of highlighting whenever you're reading through, the problem with highlighting that is as you go, you get to a sentence that you read and then you want to mark it that it's important. And what you have to do is go back and then reread that entire sentence as you highlight it. With making marks in the margin of your text, you're able to read a sentence and immediately go back up right beside it and just draw a vertical line right beside it. And that vertical line tells you that this is an important part of the text. Like this sentence is an important part of the text. And then when you go back, you can just look for vertical lines in your margins and you know where the most important parts of that page are. The other thing you can do with vertical text is you can multiply them. So you can add a second vertical line to it if there's material that's extremely important to you, that you think is more important than the other things you've highlighted. Or say that you've highlighted these two and then you think this last line is the most important, you can draw a shorter vertical line with that, and then you're drawing your attention specifically to what the most important part of that text or that paragraph is. So using vertical lines in place of highlighting will help you be quicker at making the notes of what's important, and then it allows you to designate how important something is by how many lines you add to it. The second is probably something that you already do, and that is just simply starring key points as you go along. So, right, just drawing a little asterisk symbol in the margin, or draw an actual star if you prefer. So you already do this as you read. I'm sure that many of you do. What I would recommend, though, is that where we often draw stars, we should actually just be drawing vertical lines, right? And instead, we want to save the star symbol for something that, as I say here, that are 3 to 5 key points of the entire chapter. So not 3 to 5 key points on that page, not 3 to 5 key points in that paragraph. You want to save your star symbol for the absolute important essential parts of this article. So if it's a journal article that's 20 pages long, you should have 3 to 5 stars throughout the whole thing. And that's so if you have to go back and quickly skim this article before a test, you can go through and you can look at what are the 5 most important things I should know about this article. And then that's going to give them to you in a quick way. The other mark that somebody have a question?
Yeah, can I ask how, like I do a lot of my reading on a Kindle.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any suggestions about like doing this sort of system in that context?
Yeah, so it's harder. I'm not as familiar with the Kindle. And I remember looking at using one in the past, and the primary reason I decided not to was because of this main drawback. So depending on the Kindle you have, I know some of them, the newer ones, will allow you to write margins, to write just regular notes on the page, but it still gets complicated because they're reflowed. They don't have actual pages, and so the marks can move and such. If you're using a Kindle, then I think that if I remember correctly, there's options to do different colors of highlighting. And so you might have to look within that system, even though I'm discouraging highlighting. If that's the primary way that you can work within a Kindle, then you would want to look at either using different colors or some type of different underlining or something along those lines.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wish it was more helpful, sorry. If you're using a tablet, then most tablets, most PDF software will allow you to with a stylus or even with your finger, will allow you to make these type of drawing marks on the text. And so that's what I do with a lot of mine, is I read them digitally on an iPad, and I make the marks there digitally. So I wish there was a better way with the tablet, but not that I'm aware of. Yeah, so someone suggested that Amazon now has the option of reading it on another device. So if you have a tablet or a computer, you can do that as well. Great. So the next mark is the exclamation point. And so you put this in the text where something surprises you. That's kind of self-explanatory, right? So where something surprises you, either in the sense of it's completely new material that you had never thought about, or where I often find myself using it is when an author says something that I think kind of falls outside of the norm of what the rest of scholarship is saying. So it's not surprising to me as in it's new information, but it's surprising to me that this author is making this claim when I would have expected it to go somewhere else. So an exclamation mark is just something that kind of helps point you towards, when you're reviewing, it points you towards material that was new to you or surprising to you. And so you can review that and know that this is important information that I need to make sure I absorb and process. And then the question mark seems pretty self-explanatory, right? The first use of it would just be to mark anything that you have a question about in the text. And so kind of the two aspects of that would be, one, if you don't understand what the author's saying. So you think that the author's unclear or you don't completely understand what they're saying, you can draw a question mark and mark that for you to go back and study later. The other use of it, just drawing a simple question mark, would be where you actually question the claim of the author. So the author says this, and you aren't completely sure that you agree with it, or you're not sure that they actually have proven their case. And so that's kind of the two uses of the simple question mark. And I say the simple question mark because this is kind of my own annotation that I use. But if I draw a question mark and then I put a circle around it, I use that to indicate that the author in the text is actually asking a question. So a lot of authors will state their thesis statements not as actual claims, but they'll state them kind of as research questions. And so they might say, like, well, we're setting out to know why Paul wrote the letter to the Galatians. And so if I come across an important question that the author's asking, then I'll draw this symbol, I'll draw the question mark, and I'll put a circle around it. And that helps me know that it's not my question in the text, it's actually the author's question. And it's actually going to be a main point in their argument as they go along. And then the last thing is just to make connections as you go through. And this is, again, this is a benefit that you have with writing that you don't have with highlighting. So I always say to circle key terms, essentially like vocabulary terms that you need to either learn because you're new to seminary or you're just learning the terms within the specific field of this class that you're doing. So circle the terms that are key terms that you need to know. Draw arrows between major points. So if you're surprised by something here and then it reminds you of what the author has set up above, then draw an arrow and show yourself, like, when I come back and review this surprising point needs to relate to what was set up above. And then underline helpful quotations. A little trick that I do is if I have something, specifically if you know that you're going to be writing on a material later, is I just write a Q in the margin. So anywhere that I draw a line to indicate where the boundaries of the quotation, and then I write a Q in the corner of the page. And so that tells me that on this page, there's an important quote that I need to include in my writings later. All right, any questions on annotations or any suggestions on helpful methods that you all have used? Do I have anybody from the highlighting crew who wants to offer a rebuttal for why highlighting's better?
I won't say highlight.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I now have about 100 highlighters for sale.
Listen, I'm with you, Molly, but I do both. And I think I don't do an extensive amount of highlighting, but I think that there are moments when I want to go back to a page, but I want to not even sift through all of the notations because I do a lot of this kind of thing. I want to just be able to look at something quickly and find it. And so I'll usually do that for major quotes that I want to use later and only do it for those. But I also write a lot. You know, I'll do the line down the side, but I write questions to myself and I will comment about how does this relate to so-and-so. And I think it takes longer, but I'm really in dialogue with the text by writing out not just these annotations, but questions and comments and think about X throughout. And so it does take me longer to get through a piece because of that.
Yeah. And sometimes better comprehension as you're reading does take more time. And we'll talk a little bit in just a minute about comprehension versus reading and kind of how you find a balance between those. But good. Thanks for sharing. And if anybody needs highlighters, you know who you can contact to get those. So, so let's talk a little bit then about the actual process of reading slowly. So this is going to sound like a little bit of a ridiculous statement, but the number one key to help you stop reading slowly is to stop reading slowly. And that, what I mean by that is that the American school system has trained us to read hooked on phonics style. And what hooked on phonics style is that we pronounce the words that we're reading in our head as we read along. And if you pronounce the words that you read as you read, you can only read as quickly as you can speak. And so think about, if you think about a book on tape, for instance, I enjoy listening to fiction books on tape. Most of those are probably 200 to 250 words. If I was to sit down in a vacation setting and read through that, it would take me 2 to 3 hours to read that book. If you were to download the book on tape, the book on tape is usually 10 to 12 hours long. And that's the speed difference that exists, not between being a speed reader, but just between speaking a text versus reading a text. And so what we want to try to train our brains to do is we want to train our brains to stop pronouncing every word that we're reading on the page. And instead, we want to train our brains to start recognizing clusters of words and to start recognizing important words and important phrases within sentences. And so I'm going to show you a couple of strategies to do that. But then at the end of this, the next step, I want to talk just a little bit about that maybe every word on the page doesn't actually need to be read as well. And so that's part of being a discriminate reader, is understanding what things need to be read and what things don't need to be read for your particular assignment. So I'm going to move with a little bit of speed through these strategies because we're running a little bit out of time. Oh, I'm sorry. These are actually the strategies that slow you down. So I'll move even more quickly through those. I've already said phonetic reading slows you down where you're reading things in your head. Very similar to that, but not necessarily the same thing, is reading word by word. So you're moving this has to do with the movement of your eyes. So moving your eyes from every single word on the page as you go along. The other thing that happens is strategy 2 and 3 that we're 3 and 4 that we're avoiding are actually very closely related. And that is rereading material. So whether you're aware of it or not, your eyes will tend to drift up to a page to stuff you've already read. And so if you're not intentionally keeping your eyes on the line that you're on and then to the next line and then to the next line, you actually end up rereading a couple lines on every page. And if you're rereading material, then you're actually losing time as you're doing that. The next stage is closely related, but kind of the opposite direction. Instead of going back up to material, it's going down to material. And that's just having your eyes wander. So I used the analogy before of running in the fog and looking for what's coming ahead. Your brain does not like surprises, and your brain likes to know what's coming. And so whether you're aware of it or not, your brain is consciously or subconsciously scanning the material that's coming ahead so that it can prepare and so that it knows what to expect. While this seems like it would be a good thing, what it means is that your attention is divided. And so instead of focusing specifically on the line that you're on, half of your brain is looking at what's coming ahead. Some of it's going back to what was just covered. And so we want to focus on not allowing our eyes and our brain to wander as we're doing that. And so the key solution to all of this, in my opinion, is what's called, it's the simplest method that you can come up with, and it's simply the note card method. And there's nothing revolutionary about it. As the name suggests, You just pick up a note card and you put it on the line that you're reading, and you move that note card every single line as you're reading. I prefer, and I think most people recommend, putting the note card below the line that you're reading. And so you're covering up all the material that's about to come. And what you're doing with that is you're blocking your brain from looking ahead at what's coming. And that allows you to focus fully on that page. But if you're a person who tends to reread, and that's your bigger struggle, then you can just flip the note card and do the opposite. You put the note card above the line that you're reading, and after you read that line, you move the note card down and you block out that. And that keeps you from going back to the lines that you've already covered. So I'm gonna talk a little bit more about the note card method with our next step. And so the next step is just simply as you're reading, you want to set a pace for your reading, and then you want to keep to that pace. And so this is a kind of going back to the phonetic reading and thinking about how long would it take me to read a book? How long would it take me to read material if I was just pronouncing it? And we said 10 to 12 hours for a 200 to 250 page book. So with keeping the pace, it helps to think at the outset of a book or an article. If this article's 20 pages and it takes me 2.5 minutes to read a single page, then I'm looking at close to an hour to read this single article. But if I can spend 30 seconds reading every page in this article, then I've cut my time from spending almost an hour to reading this article to spending 10 minutes reading this article. And what we can do with that is we can read the entire article in 10 minutes. We can make notes as we go along, drawing our vertical lines. And then after we've read through the whole article, maybe there's 3 or 4 paragraphs that we think, these are important paragraphs and I'm not sure I completely understand them. We can go back and read those. We can read those more carefully, we can read them more slowly, and we can take notes on them. But we don't need to reread the entire article. And this gets to what I hinted at earlier, is that not every word on a page needs to be read. In a book, honestly, not every page in a book needs to be read. Sometimes not even every chapter in a book needs to be read. So you as a reader have the right to look at a reading and to decide what things need to be read and what things don't. And this is a little bit of a skill that you develop as you go along. So, you know, if you're just beginning in an area, you may not be able to look at a book and say, oh, I don't feel like reading that chapter, and then that chapter ends up on your quiz, right? So you have to be careful about what things you decide to read and not read. But as you get familiar with the material, you'll begin to learn. Like if there's an introduction that's reviewing the history of this debate, and I'm already familiar with the history of this debate, then I can quickly scan that and see if the author adds anything new to what I already know. And if they don't, then I can just skim through it real quick and I can move on to the next section. And so think about what you're reading and why you're reading it. And if you think that something's not relevant, then feel free to skip it or feel free to just have a general knowledge of it. So with keeping the pace, I want to go back to the note card method real quick, and then I'll talk about a couple pencil methods as well. So the note card method, I talked about, you hold the note card underneath the line you're reading, you move it down as you're going through the book. One of the things that I would suggest with it is how we talked about not moving your eyes from word to word to word to word. I would suggest with the note card that you don't move it one line and stop, and one line and stop, and one line and stop. But instead, you get a pace going and you just smoothly move the note card down the page. And you set that, whatever that pace is, right? It doesn't have to be super fast, but you're moving the note card at a pace that you can keep up with the note card, or maybe even that's a little uncomfortable, that's pushing you a little bit. And by doing that, you're forcing yourself to keep a pace as you go through the page. So if you read through a line and your eyes want to go back, or your brain wants to go back and reread that sentence, you can't, because you're keeping this pace with the note card and you're having to keep up with it. And so doing that's going to help you set a pace for this page and to keep up the rhythm. And the rhythm's determined by whatever pace you've set at the beginning of that page, not by how well you did with that particular line. And so that's a way of keeping pace with it. 2 other methods. Yeah.
Excuse me, I have a quick question. And I think these are great tips. I should have come to you before I paid for this course, but how do you do that if you're making these annotations in the margins that you're going through and you're applying this note card method and you're trying to keep a pace that's fairly consistent and moves you through, but you also want to annotate when you come across things that are noteworthy? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you'll see all of the annotations that I recommended earlier. Each of those annotations would take you less than a second to write, right? And so you'll obviously have to stop your pace to make an asterisk or to make a line or to do something like that. But that's the 1 second that you're stopping your pace, and then you're back on that pace and you keep going. And if you're more of a writer that you want to write actual comments in the margin and actual thoughts in the margin, then my recommendation is do that at the end of the page. So scan the page, mark what's important in the margins, and then when you get to the bottom, you can remember what you read on that page. So then go back and write a quick sentence or two when you get to the end of that page. It's a good question. Okay, so 2 other methods that you can use. One involves the pencil, assuming you're taking notes as you're reading, or really anything that you're holding in your hand. The first is what's called the bounce method. And so I talked about not moving your eyes from word to word to word. So with the bounce method, what you're trying to do is to look at the beginning, the middle, and the end of every line. And so you're forcing your eyes not to move word by word, but to look at the beginning, the middle, and the end. And so you're doing that with a pencil. You're holding the pencil in your hand and you're placing the pencil at the beginning, middle, end, and you're just bouncing it across the page as you go. And that naturally sets a path as well. So if you get into kind of the rhythm of bouncing for each line and you just keep going down the page, then you're forcing your brain to stop reading word for word and to start reading in clusters. The other that's very similar, but it has to do more with timing instead of with the actual words, is to kind of set a pace for yourself with a pencil that you're holding and to treat it essentially like a metronome. And so you're just bouncing your pencil, and every bounce should represent a new line. So you'll be bouncing your pencil, and every time your pencil hits the desk, you know you should start a new line. And that's going to help you, as I said, not get caught up on a single line, but to move progressively through them. And then the last tip, this is one that I used during my comprehensive exams when I had a lot of material to cover, and I did the math at one point, and it would take me like a 1.5 years of work days to read through this at a casual pace. And so I knew like I have to do something quicker than that to keep up with the readings I have. Is I would actually go online. You can search for a repeating timer. I have a website here that provides one. But essentially all this does is it's a timer that runs for a certain amount of time, chimes, and then resets and runs again. And so I would set that timer for 30 seconds, for 45 seconds, and that would be my time that I had for each page of the book. And sometimes I wouldn't get through a page. Sometimes I would be 3/4 of the way through a page, but every time the timer chimed, I switched pages and I moved on. And so what this is going to force you to do as you practice it more is that it's going to force you to start thinking about what's worth reading on every page. And so the habit that I eventually developed was that when I started a new page with 45 seconds, I quickly scanned just the first couple words of every paragraph. And that told me what each paragraph is about. And then I would hone in on what paragraph on that page I thought was most important. And so this is kind of I would say like maybe a desperate maneuver when you're in crunch time and you have time that you're needing. You have a certain amount of time and you have this many pages to read, and so you have to come up with something, right? This can be a little bit of a breakneck speed as you go through it, but this is a helpful tip if you have something that you need to get through. Doing this is better than sitting down and reading at a casual pace and getting 1/10 of the way through the material you needed to read, and then not knowing 90% of the material for the text. So in an ideal world, we wouldn't need any of these methods, right? In an ideal world, we would sit down, we would read casually, we would complete all the readings we had, we would absorb everything, and we would be able to complete any exams or tests about them. As you know, we're not in an ideal world. And in seminary, we're not treating one topic at a time or one class at a time. And so all of these are, in a sense, coping strategies. They're strategies aimed at helping us keep up with the reading load that we have. They aren't necessarily strategies of what I would say are the best practices for reading on your own, if you were just reading casually. And then lastly, the tip that I think gets overlooked a lot in reading in seminary is just to enjoy the reading that you're doing. The more you can make the readings relevant to what you're doing, make them relevant to your life experiences and to your interests, the more engaged you're going to be with them as you go along. So it's very easy for us to think, I'm reading this material because it was assigned to me and the professor told me, so that's why I'm reading it. But a better approach would be for us to pause at the beginning of every reading and to think, why am I reading this personally? Why am I here at seminary? Why does this relate to what I might be doing in the future? Does it even relate? And if you feel like it doesn't, which happens sometimes in seminary, then begin to think creatively. Because a lot of that, sometimes frustration builds of, I think that I'm doing this because the professor told me, and I don't see how it relates to what I want to do with my degree. So instead of being frustrated with it, begin to think creatively. How would I use this material in a setting that isn't a seminary, in a setting that maybe isn't a church? How would I creatively engage with this? And so having those ideas will help you kind of learn to enjoy the material as you go along as well. All right, I want us to end there. We have a couple minutes if anybody has questions, so I want to open it up to any questions that anybody might have. So real quick, I'll say to everybody that I know some of you have to leave. So come and see us at the Writing Center as you work through the semester. If you have questions about material you're working on, you can come and schedule a session with Chad. You can schedule a session with any of our other tutors. And then I'm also available, not for tutoring, but if you have questions about bigger questions of strategy or approaches to programs, future decisions, stuff like that, you can also look me up on the website and schedule a meeting with me as well. And I'm happy to talk personally with you about that as well. So thank you all. If you need to leave, you're free to do that, and thank you for your participation.